How to draw a pet portrait? It's a question I get asked all the time, and with good reason. I think people can get confused and stuck inside their own heads so easily. I know I can. You sit down, you want to plan out exactly what you're going to do, think it through, which materials you might need. Is the reference photo you've got correct? How am I going to tackle those textures? Before you know it, you've completely forgotten all the skills that you already possess and how you could use them to create exactly what you see in the reference photo. I think confidence is the thing that gets in the way of so many of us, and we can plan and procrastinate until we completely forget how to put pencil to paper. So I'm going to share with you my secrets, how I get drawing, how I start planning, and when to start. So many people want to know how to do a pet portrait. I get asked it multiple times every week, and I think out of those questions, most people really want to know how to do white fur. It's white or it's black. The thing is, black fur is quite simple, but white fur is really difficult. It took me quite a long time to figure out how to approach white fur. And do you know what the trick was? It's not the white pencil, of course. It's the fact that white fur takes on indirect light around it. And this could be light coming from the blue of the sky. It could be light reflecting off the grass, in which case we end up with green. And it could also be light coming from artificial colours, bouncing off someone's top and onto the fur if they're standing too close. The thing is, when it comes to do white fur, the white pencil is probably the last pencil that you actually need to reach for. So let's start with your materials. So the materials that I've chosen to use for this pet portrait start with the sand-coloured Clairefontaine Pastelmat. This Pastelmat is probably my most favourite value and colour to use, and I'll always have it in stock. My second favourite would be the light blue, which is a really, really pale blue. It's hardly blue at all, to be honest. But the reason I like both of these papers so much is because it's about a mid-tone value, just slightly lighter. It shows up my whole range of pencils really well. If I went for a paper that was a lot darker, I end up losing my sort of dark mid-tone pencils in the page itself. They don't contrast enough. And then I find that the lighter tones can almost look a little bit false, and that some of the pencils can really struggle to cover the grain of a dark piece of card, especially if I'm using some of the harder brands like Faber Castell that I often use. So I'm going to be using this sand-coloured Clairefontaine Pastelmat. I'm using the paper today, and it goes a step further because in this pet portrait you'll notice that there are loads of warm tones, and that's coming from the tiles that the dog is resting on. And if you know my work, you know I'm not a big fan of doing backgrounds. It's not really my thing. So this colour of card is going to be absolutely perfect to stand in as the tiles. So for all of those reasons, I think the sand is a really beautiful choice for this pet portrait. But if you are struggling to know which colour of card to go for, then I would say that the light blue or the sand is a solid choice, no matter what your reference photo is. When it comes to your pencils, part of this is personal preference. I'm going to be using a small variety of different brands. Obviously, the brand that I use the most at the moment is the Faber Castell Pit Pastel pencil, and that is going to be featuring. But I'm also going to be using the Carbothello pencil from Stabilo, which I really enjoy using. It's very soft and has a beautiful ivory, the 105 in particular. And I will also be using a few of the Caran Dash pencils as well, because again, they're really soft and it covers the paper beautifully for these lighter values. I've also got a lovely grey that's going to help me out for the areas of blue reflected light just on the nose. Their light grey has a lot of blue in it naturally, and that's going to be perfect for those sections where we need to catch the blue sky. To add to these pencils, I will be using the Vista from Cretacolor, which is a lovely golden colour, and I'll also be using the 132 from Faber Castell, which is a light pink, and I'll often use both of these pencils when it comes to doing ivory or white fur. I'll also be reaching for a blue, but as I've said, I've already got a very blue-grey anyway, but the 140 from Faber Castell is a beautiful choice, and I am also going to use a light blue from Caran simply because I have it in my stock and I think it will work nicely in the eye. I'm then also going to sneak in a little bit of purple, and this will be coming in when we do the black fur. Now, if you're struggling to pick out the pencils for your projects on a regular basis, and this is something that a lot of beginners struggle with, then over in the membership you will find that I have a full list of suggested palettes. And these will range from black to white to chocolate to tan to red. Every single different colour of fur is in there with a suggested palette and how to use it within 10 to 15 minutes so that you can get started on your own projects confidently and not be held back by material choices. So if you want a full tutorial on transferring images and getting a trace image, I have a proper video for that linked below. So you can use transfer paper. I'm not as fancy as that, but it is obviously a little bit quicker. I tend to just hold my paper up to the light, as you can see, really old school, and I can just mark out where I'm going to need to put my pastel. I nearly always begin with the eyes for a painting. The reason for this is it helps me with those values, with the lights and the darks that I'm going to need for the underpainting, because in an eye you've usually got some of your lightest lights with a reflection and then the darkest darks with the black of the pupil, and quite often the shadow as well around the eye is black or very, very close to black, and then this gives you more of a context when you're looking at your page. So if you are stuck for where to begin, I'd probably recommend starting with the eyes. On a piece like this, I am actually quite tempted to go in with the underpainting because we have large areas which are black and we know they need to be black, and then we have this lovely white fur as well. So there is a way to balance this out quite easily without having to put in the eyes first, because we can start off with our darkest darks and then we can measure from there. However, for continuity's sake, let's start with the eyes today. If you want to start with the general underpainting first, then please be my guest. So I'm going to start with the eye on the right because this eye is in the direct light. So we have the black of the pupil, but then the iris is incredibly light, and then of course we have the fur around it as well. If I started with the eye on the other side, we haven't got our lightest light or near lightest light and darkest dark. We've pretty much just got our darks in that eye because of course it is in shadow. So unusually for me, I am starting with the white. This is Stabilo Carbothello 100, and I'm just using this over the Faber Castell at the moment because it's very soft and I'm going to want the white to mix with some other layers. So it's just a bit easier. Don't worry, you don't need to have this pencil. But the reason I'm starting with the white here is because we are working on a mid-tone paper. And when the paper is clean like this is when we're going to be able to get our purest whites to show up. So it's sort of like watercolour in that you want to preserve the areas that need to be light early on, because otherwise if I went in with blue straight away, I'm not going to be able to get these areas light enough afterwards. I think the blue is just going to be too strong. So I'm going in with white first. It's going to add some glow into the beautiful bright blue eye, and then I can go over with my other colours and go backwards and forwards then with the white, using it like a blending tool instead of going in and trying to make the white show up nice and pure. The blue of choice today is light blue. This is a Caran pencil. Again, you do not need to have this Caran pencil. It's just a really beautiful colour, so I thought I might as well use it as I have it in my collection. Another lovely blue would be the Faber Castell 140 that we will probably actually use later on in this painting. And there is also a Stabilo Carbothello that is just here, the 440. That's a lovely blue too, and about half the price of the one in my hand. So you really do not need to have the exact colours. This pencil is nice and soft, so of course it's going to mix well with the white that's in there. I think I am going to add a bit of the Stabilo Carbothello 140 blue too. This is a very ice blue, and I think I actually need to warm the blue up ever so slightly. So as I have it, I will use it. So I'm just going to pop that one down. You'll see a huge difference between the two blues here. This blue feels a lot darker and it feels more lavender-like. So this is a 140 from Faber Castell. I'm going to use this around the pupil. Again, we can see a lot of blue concentrated around there. I've got another trick up my sleeve for this bit as well. And pop a little bit around the outside. Glaze very, very gently over the top. And let's get some darks on there. We really need to get darks on there quite quickly because they're going to help with the context of how bright the blue is. As I said, I'm getting a bit carried away there really, but we need that white to glow through. So if I add too much blue too quickly, it's kind of like game over and you want to start again. So this is the 199 from Faber Castell. It's their black. Use whichever black you like or have in your collection. So I'm just going to be tapping this off. You can see now we've put the black down that everything else starts to jump up the value scale and appear to be lighter than it did a moment ago. I've still got the black in my hand. We're not going to leave it all like this, but I'm going to start to outline the eye carefully with the black. I go around lightly first to check that I'm happy with my outline. And I do this for any type of eye. Check that I'm happy first before I start committing to these really, really dark shapes that I'm about to put down. So I think I'm happy with that. So with the 199, and we will be changing some of this, I'm going to go in and give myself a base of the 199. Now, something I'd love to draw your attention to at this stage, and I don't think enough people talk about, and it's definitely going to affect you if you are a beginner, especially, or if you've been drawing by yourself and just haven't had very much direction yet, is the difference between this dark and the light and the edge there, the edge that we've created. It's a very hard edge. And while in the photograph, of course, this is a defined edge, leaving edges too sharp will make something feel flat. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to start off with the pupil, and you can see this in the photo, but the pupil is not a defined perfect shape. So I've just picked up a different pencil, the 157. It's really, really dark. It's about a shade lighter than the black, but it's also got blue in there. So of course it's going to work really nicely with what we've already got down. And I'm not putting any pressure through the pencil, but I'm moving in the tiniest little circles imaginable right around the edge of the pupil. And already that pupil feels like it's more a part of the eye. There's plenty more work to do, but it's starting to feel like it's part of a whole. So keeping this pencil in hand, and I could move to my dark grey, the 181, that is our cool dark grey, but I quite like the effect of this pencil. I'm just going to move around, particularly on the left-hand side of the eyeball, which is slightly in shadow. Tiny, tiny little markings, pretty much no pressure. It's going to show up really, really easily. Okay, so here starts the backwards and forwards movement that you often see me doing. Using my pencils like blending tools, I can go through my previous pencils. Again, honestly, hardly any pressure through the pencil is required for this because the eye is just so, so light. I'm going to re-establish the black of the pupil because it will easily pick up dust of the other tones and colours and become lighter than we want it to be. So I've gone backwards and forwards a few times with the blues, and now I'm going to pick up the white. So there is a beautiful bright highlight here, and I've left a lot of that area alone, to be honest. So I'm going to re-establish that. And then there is some catch light further around. It's a bit softer, so I'm not pressing as hard and just allowing the white to melt into the other work there. So you get different effects by putting the blue over the white or putting the white over the blue. Effectively, we are just blending them together at this stage. Now, something I would say is resist the urge to blow on your work now because this eye will muddy quite quickly. We've got some really dark, pungent tones, and we've also got our really clean whites in there as well. So we don't want to muddy them. And the only way to avoid doing that is to really just tap your work off very carefully instead. Tip the work slightly forward when you do it to try and allow the dust to fall instead of fall down the page. Okay, so that is the first eye in. So we have some really light values placed directly next to some very dark values. Now the way this eye is going to start to feel real is when we put the eye socket in around it, those features that need to go in. But before I do that, I'm going to work on the eye on the left-hand side. Now, as I said, this eye is very, very dark. It's almost completely, well, it is completely in shadow. So there's going to be a lot of black that we need in here. And I'm therefore going to actually start with the black. We can't see pure, bright, sort of almost crystal blue in this eye. It's incredibly dark and incredibly grey. So once again, start out by picking out your outline and checking that you really are happy with where that is. Okay, all of that done. This is going to be way too bright, but just to get some blue pigment in there, I'm going to go in with the 140. The reason I'm not worried about the fact that that is way too bright is because as a tone, as a value, it's going to be very easy to just knock it back by glazing over the top with my darker pencils. So with pastel pencils, the darks will always sit over the lighter values and colours really quite easily. So I will need to reduce, to be honest, most of the colour in there, but it's nice to have a little bit to mix in as I go so it doesn't become just grey. So this is the 157, again, incredibly dark. And then I'm going to turn to the 181 if you have it, which is the dark, sorry, I was about to say the dark light grey, the dark cool grey from Faber Castell. So this is like a very, very desaturated blue, but with the extra blue pigment sat underneath it, it's just going to have a little bit more oomph to it than it would have ordinarily. Going back in with the black. So again, beginners especially, pay attention here, we are creating really, really soft edges between those two different pencils that we have in here so that the edge around that iris is very, very, very soft. And that's because it's in the dark and we can't see fine details nearly as easily when there isn't as much light. But if all of this is a bit much and you prefer things in bite-sized chunks, you should try the membership. Courses are broken down into chapters and your place is automatically saved. There's even a weekend-length project area for all you busy people out there. But I digress. On with the show. So I can just pick out an ever so slightly lighter tone in the iris. We really don't want to go that light. It's so tempting to start to put in lots of details, but we can always make it lighter later on if we need to. But for the balance of this, the iris is going to have to stay very, very dark, unusually dark. So that is a mid-grey, used feather light, and you can see I've caught a tiny catch of light just here and a tiny catch of light correspondingly on the other side, and that is about as light as I want to go with that. Now the reason we can get away with this, as I said, is because of those soft edges in there. The soft edges are just so important. I talk about it quite a bit in the membership. I've got a fundamentals course for beginners, and then I've got some more advanced theory lessons, and we really do go into edges and how they just progress your work massively. They're so important. Okay, so white fur is never white, and we're going to start with that right from the beginning. For these shadows, these are all very warm. So I'm going to start with the 180. Now, the reason that I know that we need warm tones in here is because of the reflected light. Reflected light is light that isn't direct. So direct light for this photo looks like it's coming through a window from the sun. And therefore, indirect light or reflected light is being bounced off another surface or is coming from the blue sky. Now, in this case, the dog is inside and has a roof over its head, but does have a seemingly large window to one side, which I'll come to in a moment. But the floor is going to be providing the reflected light. It's a hard surface, and you can see it's definitely going to reflect the sun quite well. I would say it's probably an overcast bright day maybe? Difficult to tell. Anyway, the floor is what is giving us our reflected light for this particular photo, and the floor is a nice sand colour. It's a warm colour, effectively. Very, very desaturated, but it is warm. White fur, especially when it isn't in direct sunlight, because when white is in direct sunlight, it's completely saturated. So as soon as we start to lose that light, white takes on the reflected colours around it really, really well and can tell us a lot about the surroundings. So in this situation, we have white fur on this side of the face. It's not catching beautiful direct sunlight, so it's not going to be fully saturated and white. Instead, it's going to be mostly catching the reflected light from the surroundings, and the closest object to it is the floor, which is warm. And this is why I'm going in with the brown. So it's like a little bit of detective work. We will be putting a little bit of blue in because you'll probably be sat there thinking, I see loads of people use blue when it comes to doing white fur. I'm a big fan of using blue and white fur, but it's using it appropriately. And for this reference photo, there was a lot of warmth. So I could have either made the decision to make everything cool, or as I'm doing, I'm going to respect the reference photo. And instead we're making things warm to start with. A lot of this 180 actually won't be able to be seen particularly well, but I like to add it in. It really, really helps me see things as I'm building up an underpainting. So as I said, the blue sky, I said I was going to come back to that. So the blue sky can, in my opinion, only be seen in a couple of patches. It can be seen here, and we've got a little bit here as well. And this is because the right-hand side of her face, or his face here, this plane of the face, this is catching the sunlight, and sunlight is yellow. So this, again, although it's more saturated white, it's getting closer to white instead of this really dark value here, it has got a warmth to it. Whereas this patch on top of the nose and this patch here, this is turned into the light from the window just enough, but not directly to catch the sunbeams, and instead it's catching reflected light from the sky. And if you have a look at the photo, you can see that this feels slightly cooler. And if you put this into Photoshop, or to be honest, any simple photo editor, if you take the saturation up to a stupidly high level, as high as it will go, you'll probably find that this patch will end up going a bluey purple colour. And therefore you can see that there is some blue in there. So we will definitely be adding that into this drawing, and it will help to bring a lot more dimension into the white fur. But for this specific white fur, we are going to be going quite dark unusually, and that is because the dog's on the floor, and because the dog's on the floor, it's not catching bright reflected light. There isn't as much space for the light to be able to get into this gap down here because the dog's head is blocking it and it's on the floor. So it's a slightly unusual pose, but it poses a really, really nice study for us as artists, because we can really use a variety of skills, to be honest. So it's going to make a really, really nice drawing. Okay, so that's how I arrived at the conclusion of warm, darker white fur. And this isn't going to look white at all when it goes in. It's going to look really, really odd to start with. Now, if we just pause here a minute and take a look at the reference photo, you can see in the reference photo that this is black here. The eyelid, you can see it is. And then have a look at this. This looks quite dark already, the 180. When I was going down initially, you probably thought that's too dark. But look again at the reference photo and the difference between the black and the area around it. Sorry if you can hear some background noise. I think all the kids are coming home from school at the minute. So what this tells us is actually this needs to go so much darker than it currently is. Loads darker. I am going to end up using my dark grey, but I'll probably use the mid-grey with it. There are slight changes in tone on the shaded side of the face, but I'll put it in as a flat tone to start with. It's much easier to see where to go from there. Okay, so instead of the 181, which is our cool dark grey that we used in the eye, I'm using the 175 because it's our warm dark grey, and as we've already established, these shadows are very, very warm. So I'm going to use the pencil slightly on the side, just as I was doing with the 180, because it means that everything is kept nice and soft, and I'm going to start to fill this in. I'm going to work backwards and forwards. We really do need to build this up and create quite a thick underpainting. So the reason I want this to be fairly thick is because the husky fur is very, very thick, and it's densely layered. So instead of seeing down into the fur, as we might do with wiry fur dogs, or if there were loads of curls that lift out and away from the form, with this dog, we're actually seeing quite a flat surface. I suppose is a good way to describe it. We're not seeing down into that structure, all of those different layers of fur. We need to create this pretty solid looking base for the details to sit on top of. And actually on the shaded side of the face, we won't be putting in many details at all. Again, it all comes back to your edge management, but it also comes back to the value scale. And if you want to learn more about that, I do go into that in quite a lot of detail in the advanced theory part of the membership, because I know it's an area that can become quite confusing, but it's really, really important to learn about it and start to understand how everything works together. So I'm using the 175 to go around the eye and working into that black edge and making it effectively melt away. It will be lighter, just here you can see I've left a patch there, and I can put some light hairs on top of this, which will look absolutely beautiful. So as I said, I'm going to put all of this in pretty much as a flat tone, and then I can work back into it as we build up the rest of the dog, and we can make areas slightly lighter, and we can also take areas slightly darker as needed. If you do struggle to see things like this, then using a tool like a colour picker is a great way to start. And it can just help you see which tones you should be picking out to begin with and measure them against a black and a white. And then you can start to see which pencil you might require, because especially in the Faber Castell set, it's kind of almost easy in that you've got about, I think, 5 pencils to choose from on a tonal scale if we're just working with black and white. You've got your black, you've got your 2 dark greys, but they're the same tone. So you can look at it as 1 pencil when we're choosing a value. And then you've got your mid-tones, again, 2 pencils, but they're the same tone. And then you've got your light greys, again, 2 pencils, same tone, and the white. So kind of pick out 1 for each area and fill it in a really basic way and see how the form starts to come together better than choosing each individual little area and trying to fill in the details too quickly. Filling in details too quickly usually means you end up with quite a flat painting because you forget, quite literally, the bigger picture. And you kind of run out of values, and that's what I go into in the membership, is how to use your value scale properly so that you can balance everything and make sure that you don't run out of pencils too quickly. So if you just pull the paper away, already it does look so much better, because look at the eye on the left-hand side. Suddenly that is sat inside that plane of the head so much better. Now we can actually see that some of these areas can come lighter, which is music to my ears, because when we add our details over the top, they should be a slightly lighter tone than the underpainting. Now, as I said, in the shadows, we won't really be adding that many details, to be totally honest, but a few are quite nice just to add a little bit of texture. So for the brows, then the next areas I'm probably going to fill in, because this bit here especially, this is probably the next darkest area. I'm going to add some 182. You could use the 180 if that's all you've got. As we get into the areas of light, we're getting more sun, remember, and more sun means more warmth. So I just want to go a little bit stronger on the yellow, especially because these are mid-tones, they can take it. Working around these cool blue eyes with the slightly warmer, well, very much warmer in comparison, these warmer pencils makes that blue also feel more intense. So that's quite a nice little trick. Throwing anything into contrast, black and white, the black looks darker, the white looks lighter than if the white was placed next to a light grey, because what we've done by placing the white next to a black is increase the contrast. So by placing what is known as a cool colour, the blue, next to what could be considered a warm colour, which would be this kind of golden, we are making that blue look cooler by contrast. Now, as I said, I can see blue on the nose. Be very, very careful how I do this. I'm going to take the 140. It's a lovely blue that we have used a little bit of in the eye. And for me, it works well as a blue for reflected light from the sky. I will use it for things like black Labradors too. And I'm just going to glaze a little bit onto the nose. Again, I am using my pencil on the side to avoid it going down too heavy and avoid too many directional pencil marks. And then I can just see a little bit down here as well, just a touch. So I'm going to go over this brow, which is about a mid-tone, I would say. So this is my mid-tone grey, the 273. And again, you can see I'm using it on the side, and I'm not worried about joining areas of these underpaintings together. That really helps because this is all one dog. It's just catching the light in different ways. So I'm just sweeping this pencil over and into the edge of the darker tones there. And then just into the top half of this brow before it turns into the light and becomes a lot lighter. So now I'm going to be working with a variety of pencils that, in my opinion, sit somewhere in this region. So to fill in this side of the face, we have to work out which values we need to use. Value 1 is black, and we've used some black over here on this side of the face, and a value 2 just about, which is this dark grey as well. Value number 5 for the Faber Castell pencils is roughly this medium grey, either the 273 or the 233, and we've already used some of that up here on the brows. But for the rest of the underpainting on this side of the face, it's not white, but it's lighter than this medium grey, so I need pencils that sit in the middle. For the Faber Castell range, that only leaves me with one pencil, which is too light in my opinion for quite a lot of it, and that would be the light grey. So 270 or 230. 230 is the cool, 270 is the warm. However, I'm not just restricted to those pencils because of course I am a self-confessed pencil hoarder. So therefore I have a few other greys to choose from. One that I love to use a lot and is very appropriate for this drawing is the yellow grey from Colour because it's a warm yellow grey. It would work really well on this side of the face. I've also got this grey from Carbothello, the 720. It's cooler, and it's probably a shade lighter, but it's not as dark. It's not as light as the light grey from Faber Castell, so another good option there. And then one that I really, really love is, now I've only got a tiny nub of this left, it's the 722 from Carbothello, and that's a very blue grey, so guess where I might want to use that. But because I've got more of it and it's not quite as pungent and slightly lighter, which I think will work better, I'm probably going to use the light grey, just called light grey, from Caran, which is the 788. But I'll have to be careful with it because from my memory, that puts down quite a lot of pigment, so I might just want to mix them together. So to go with my selection of greys, I also need to think about the colours that I'm putting underneath. So far I've used these colours, which tonally are quite dark, mid-tone to dark, and they're going to be too dark to do these sections here. You can see I've put some of the 182 down already in the slightly darker areas, but I've still got patches which are completely blank and they need warming up. There's kind of an almost pinky tinge to some of this. So a pencil I like to use for this is the 132 Pink, and I like to partner it with the Bista from Colour. Now tonally, these pencils are lighter, but they're not as light as the light grey from Faber Castell, so they should work quite well for these areas and they add a good luminosity as well. So I think those will be a good choice for these areas. You could also use, again, some fan favourites of mine, such as the Ochre Dark from Colour, completely losing the name of my pencils there, but to be honest, it's quite orange and I think we're going slightly more pinky than that. So down with the Bista. The Bista, as you can see, is a wonderful colour. It works so well for blonde dogs. If you're struggling to do blonde fur, I cannot recommend getting the Bista enough. It's an absolutely fabulous pencil for those kind of areas. And if you are struggling with choosing palettes for your pet portraits or any kind of drawing, then in the membership, I've got suggested palette sections, and they're just nice short videos about 5 minutes or so long. And I'll take you through a suggested palette for like a blue dog, if you've got a blue Staffy, for example, or black Labrador for a warm black lab, or for a cool black Labrador photo, depending on what you've been served with. So I go through a variety of different coat colours that you could be faced with, and it kind of just gives you a starter set to work with, because I think for a lot of people, that is the most difficult place, is understanding which pencils you need to pick out. Okay, so that's some of the Bista, and I'm going to add some of the pink because I can see a nice pinky glow into some of these areas. We'll just add a little bit of vibrancy in there as these two colours bounce against each other. Okay, so it's time to start on the greys. I'm going to begin with the light grey, literally called light grey, 788 from Caran. So obviously if you haven't got this pencil, do not worry. You can use any coolish grey, but I would say that the 722 from Carbothello would be a nice choice. It's probably going to end up being a bit too on the nose. Excuse the pun, that really wasn't intended. Awful. It's probably going to end up being a bit too blue, as you can see, especially partnered with the blue underneath it, so I will actually have to cool that down anyway. I think the tone is about right, which of course is the most important thing, but it's just a little bit too blue. So I'm going to tamper that down with some of the 720 from Carbothello. So this is a warmer grey by comparison. It is a little bit lighter as well, so just need to be a bit careful of that. That looks a bit better. So I've now got my yellow grey from Colour and my 720 from Carbothello. I am really struggling with the names of my pencils today. I do apologise, everyone. And start to fill in the rest of these areas. Now, when I say fill in, I'm not actually pressing very hard, but I am glazing over the top. And again, I'm thinking about my edges and starting to join things together. This section around the eye, it does need to be a little bit darker than that. So mixing in some of my mid grey, because it's going on top of other tones, it's not actually going to end up as these patches over there, but these areas do need to come a little bit darker in value. I've got some slightly darker values just coming up the side of the nose. We need to put in this whole dark shadow at the front of the nose as well. Not left that for any particular reason. If you're wondering, I've just kind of left it. I suppose that kind of happens when you're drawing. end up with patches that haven't been filled in, but not for any specific reason, they've just not been filled in. Again, just softening this edge in the underpainting between that dark tone down the middle of the face and the lighter areas. Taking my yellow grey again. Lovely, so believe it or not, that is a really good structure for the start of the face. I'm going to now fill in the nose and this area at the front, which will be pretty quick, to be honest, because where you can't see a detail in your photograph, don't be tempted to put it in just because you know it's there. If you know it's there, great, but it doesn't mean we can see it. So I'm going to start off with the tiny reflection, just using one of my kind of mid-light greys. Tiny reflection down here, that's telling us where the nostril is. And then again, on the top of the nose, there's a lovely, lovely reflection up there, which is going to actually need a little bit of blue in it, but we will sort that out later on. Tiny reflection just down there at the bottom. That's about it. So I'm going to start with the black, fill in this nostril, and I'm just going to start to build it out. So again, I'm going to start off just by shading things in, just nice and quickly and loosely. So this is the dark, warm grey. Just swap to that because the black was feeling a bit too dark for picking it all out. I think some of it's going to end up just being dark, warm grey. So I've just sketched over this area, which will remain lighter. And then I'm going to start to work back in with my black. So I'm working from the darkest side. So we know there's a nostril in there on the left. Can't see it. For now, I'm just going straight over it. I want all of my shadows to be so soft, all the edges really blurred. That should mean that we won't actually need to fill in that section of the nose, and that if we did, it would look wrong because we'd have too much light in the shadow to be able to bring out that much detail. So I'm just going to put in the start of this shadow with, this is the warm dark grey. And it's just so I can join the bottom of the lip into the shadow there. And then also provide contrast here where we're going to have a lighter tone. We can just see some of the light fur, which I think I can probably put in with the yellow grey. It's not as light as you think it all is because it's all being contrasted so much. So with that huge mass of black in, you can suddenly see that this area starts to feel lighter by contrast and everything just shifts and changes continuously as we're filling it in and we are getting more value down. To say that this has ended up being the lightest section, that was completely accidental, so it's a little bit annoying, and that's because of the blue-grey that I used. It's a bit too vibrant, but we are going to be putting other layers on top of this section anyway, which are going to help to bring it forward, so I'm not too worried about it. Okay, let's carry on and fill in the area for black fur. Now, the area for black fur, especially on this side of the face, is super simple because we are literally colouring it in black. And with most black dogs, you will honestly have this as the case 9 times out of 10, that all of the shadows need to be pitch black. And in fact, you put no details in. It can feel a little bit like you're cheating almost, and people want to put details in, but then as soon as you start to put all those details in, you lose the magic because you run out of values on your tonal scale, which again, as I say, I go into it in more detail in the membership course because it is a lesson in and of itself. But in essence, what you need to know is don't put details in. Can't see them, don't put them in. Okay, so we start to get around to the top of the head here. This is starting to catch the light and we are going to do something slightly different with it. But for now, I'm filling it all in with black, and this is how I approach drawing most black dogs. So what I've done is I've used a mix. I used my pencil, but to be honest, I started to get a little bit bored. And that's when I take out the blocks of pastels instead. So you can just use your pencil for all of this. You don't need a block of pastel at all, but obviously it's just quicker. So I used a soft tool, but this is not the board, this is the paper. It's a little bit thinner. And I actually found that this just pushed it around a little bit. It's the Conte pastel block I was using, so that might be why. So I just used my finger instead and kind of pushed it in, kept tapping the paper off, and make sure you do tap it off because black dust will get everywhere. And what I've done is I've left just a tiny little swatch here at the top, and that denotes where the top of the head is. But to be honest, they kind of just merge straight in, and that will make sense later on when we get our lighter tones down over the underpainting on the face. But for now, I'm going to finish off the underpainting on the face by doing the ears. So the ear on this side, on the left-hand side, is super dark, as you might imagine, just as everything is on that side of the face. So I'm going to start off with the 175, and that, to be honest, that might be enough for the underpainting because we can put our lighter tones on top. But let's see. So you can see I've left this top section a little bit lighter, and that's because it is lighter in the photo. And I am going to go in and just add a tiny little bit of the mid-grey, but I'm really going to be as restrained as possible. Just pop a tiny little bit in because it's going to come too light too quickly, and we have got some details to put onto that area. So those details will go in as lighter tones anyway. Okay. Mixing together these two sections, that black in the centre of the ear and the underpainting for the rest of it, because I'm going to denote those two sections with the long fur coming out of the edge of the ear instead. So that's what's going to separate them, but the underpainting itself is going to be super buttery, smooth, and just melt together. It's going to look really lovely. All right. So dark side is done. Let's do the lighter side now. So I'm getting some warm, almost blush tones inside this ear here. So there are a variety of pencils that you can use to create that. I'm going to add, to start with, the 182 pretty much all over. So this is that nice golden brown. So that's given it a lovely glow. And now I want to get some of those blush tones in there. So 194 if you've got it, or even the 169, but you just need to be quite light with these pencils because the value of this pencil is low. It's actually quite a dark pencil if I was to press too hard for this. And obviously we don't want the ear to become super purple either, but this is, remember, the underpainting. It's not going to end up being the main show. So I've got some of that warmth in there, which is working really, really nicely. I'm going to take my pink as well. I'm basically just having fun mixing my different colours together. So this is the 132, and that is one of my favourite pencils to use. I'm just adding that in so that I'm making the area a bit lighter. I'm not so interested in that, to be honest, but again, adding more of that pinky feel, which works really nicely when I then add this one in, which is the Bister, and that is the slightly more yellow blonde coloured pencil. So obviously all of this needs desaturating. We need a lot more grey in here, but this is what I love about doing an underpainting, is that you can have quite a bit of fun and really put some colours in there, and then you can push and pull them depending on how much you really want at the end. But it's nice to start off a little bit more vibrant than normal. So I just picked out a pencil and then put it back. It's not quite right. I'm going to go in with the yellow grey from Carbothello. I had picked out one of the Carbothello pencils, but it was too light. So the reason I'm going over with the yellow grey is because, as I said, I want to push and pull the colour, and here I just want to push it back. We don't want quite as much. Still leaves a fair amount coming through. And remember, it's all about context when you're doing this kind of thing. If I was to just single in on that tiny area, you wouldn't think there's a lot of colour in there at all. You might not even be able to pick very much out if that was just the only thing you could see. But in the context of this whole piece, that becomes really quite colourful and very purple in there. Even though those colours are measured, they're muted, they're knocked back, however you want to put it, they are still in there. And in the context of this whole piece, they show up quite nicely. So that's always what you've got to think about whenever you're doing a piece of art, is the context which a colour or a value appears in. So I'm just going to go around, just using my yellow grey for this because it works fine. And I'm just softening the edge between the white underpainting, although obviously it's not white, it's dark grey, and the black underpainting. Again, thinking about edges all the time. I'm going to do a few special things on some of the edges. I'm going to come back around, but for now I'm kind of using this like a blending tool, You can use your finger as well. So in the area of light, as I said, we are going to treat that a little bit differently, the black fur that is, in the lit plane of the face. So whenever you're doing black fur, I often see people reaching, for their blues and their purples, which can make a degree of sense. And it comes back to what we were talking about in the white fur. To be honest, doing white and black fur, they rely on similar principles. Black overall is easier. And the reason being, as I said, white fur, unless it's really brightly lit, white fur picks up all of the reflected colours around it very easily. And therefore, you can actually end up with loads of different colours, very, very muted, but loads of different colours. And they're just being reflected off the floor, off the grass, off someone's t-shirt, whatever it is. And they can all end up appearing in the white fur. So black fur works the same in that, like anything, it will pick up the reflected colours, and because we've only really got a tone to work with, it can appear to be quite shocking in terms of if this dog was sat next to a green hedge, we could get quite a lot of reflected green light, even on the dark side of the face. It could be bouncing off the green hedge and onto the black fur, and we could end up with a green halo of light, which could be really nice from an artistic point of view. And then likewise, from the sky, the light, reflected light coming down is blue, and we often see that in the black fur. We'll often see blue in the lit areas, even if they're not the strongest lit areas, because of course those areas are getting yellow light in from the sun, and that could appear as much more of a warm grey, it often does. But we will often find some blue tones in the fur. Now, for this specific painting, we can't really see blue in the fur that easily. But what we can do is we can lean into a little bit of colour theory here, and again, more information about all of this in the membership because it does take quite a while, so there's not space to do it here. So I'm going to be putting a purplish colour into the edge between the white fur and the black fur. So in nature, we will often see purple-blue colours in the shadows, and the reason for that is it's the longest wavelength. We're not actually adapted to see purple-blue particularly well as human beings. We're adapted to see the middle, the two middle colours, which would be the yellow-green intersect, and that's why we also see those colours as really bright, because we've adapted to see them in daylight, which makes sense. When we were out hunter-gatherer people, we needed to look after ourselves, and we'd be in probably forest habitat, so if we can see well in the yellow-green colour range, then we're going to be able to protect ourselves best. But basically the purple-blue range, we aren't as well adapted to see. It's a very long wavelength, and we see it in the shadows, and it's a very dark colour to the human eye, very, very dark. So this works super well in the blacks, because of course black is dark, by making them feel a bit more rounded to us naturally, but it won't make them too bright because it is a very dark colour to our eye. So I can go around the edge of the black with this purple. I'm basically going to do it in the lit areas. And then we will also add just a little bit of this into some of the detail when we get to it in the black fur. So I'm going to use my finger, be fairly messy about this, go around, because again, it's a push and pull. We don't want it to be actually purple, but a little bit of that purple in there from, especially in person, it works really, really well. And again, it just makes the edge between these two patches a little bit more realistic to the human eye. It doesn't soften it that much in terms of we've not gone from dark to medium to medium light to light. We haven't taken that many steps, but we've started to introduce just this wisp, this haze of colour along the edge between pure tone and muted colours. So we are reducing the difference between these two sections because we've added a little bit of colour, just a touch of colour into this dark section, and it just helps knit them together that much better. And blue will also work quite nicely, but as I say, really use blue for the reflected light, because what we're saying is we can see the blue sky in the black fur. So I do have to apologise. I was so excited to get on with the details that I forgot to start recording. Classic Emily mistake. So I'm starting with the yellow grey from Carbothello, and I sharpened up my pencil really, really well for this. Now, when I'm creating fur like this for a husky, it needs to have the feeling of being very, very thick, but each individual hair itself is fairly fine. So what you want are lots and lots of hairs densely packed, but they need to flow into each other really, really nicely. If you start to add lots of hairs very quickly, trying to fill the area and not take too much time over it, then you're going to end up with the hairs cross-hatching and you'll have the wrong effect by the end. So do take your time over this step. So I'm being careful between the different patches of underpainting, and I'm swapping here to my mid grey, which is 273. Yes, 273. There's a 273 and a 233. It is the 273 that I would prefer for this because it's the warm variation, and all of this fur is very warm. So I'm going over the areas of darker underpainting with my mid grey. I am weaving bits of the mid grey into the edges, which are slightly lighter there. Everything is completely fluid and joined together. It's just that it's going from the lighter patch into the slightly darker patch. So as I go through this, I'm going to start to adjust areas of the underpainting as I go, because as I said at the beginning, some of this is going to need to be lighter, and I'll mainly be doing that by adding a few careful details on top, and some of this is going to need to be darker. Just taking the 175 again, just making this area a little bit darker. I'm going to mix between the mid grey and the dark grey. The dark grey is going to be a little bit too dark for this, but the mid grey by itself is actually a bit too light. So we just need to create a new value that we haven't got a pre-mixed pencil for by glazing between the two different pencils until we end up with a nice happy medium. See, already it starts to feel more like the photograph quite quickly. And it's almost a little bit disconcerting to watch the values appear to change on the page and get lighter or darker, and the fur start to feel a little bit more like the white or warm white fur that we can see in the photograph. I'm just going to put a few darker hairs in between. This is where we are seeing right down in between the individual hairs to the skin, which you will often find around the eye. Around the eye we'll probably have the darkest patches usually. Just want to actually use a tiny bit of the 199, which is the black for Faber Castell, and just nestle the eye in even more. I really like to make quite a big thing of the dark areas around the eyes. It makes them look really beautiful. So I've got some of the details in here, and I just started softening the edge there with the mid grey between the darker patch and this lighter patch, and we will have some pretty defined details actually happening along that edge. But what I'd now like to do, now that we've got this in and it's starting to come out a little bit more, I do want to add more depth into that. I actually want to go and work and pretty much finish this dark section of light fur, and I'm going to do that between probably the dark grey and this mid grey and mix them together until I start to get those ever so slight tonal shifts, and there are a couple of temperature shifts I think as well in there that need to happen. So I'm going to use those pencils, and I'm probably let's pick out the 180, which was a brown pencil that we used right at the beginning. You can't really see loads of that left, but there is still evidence of it in the underpainting. So that actually works really, really nicely as a blending tool, and it also helps to maintain the warmer colours that we have on this side of the face. So whenever I'm doing white fur, I will nearly always return to colour temperature at some point or other. Colour temperature is interesting because it kind of doesn't exist. And again, this is something that I really explore over a few videos in the membership. But the idea is that you have your coolest colour over the entire colour wheel, if we were to look at every single colour, and that is teal. And then you have your warmest colour out of, again, every single colour, and that would be an orange-red. So to assess whether a colour is, in inverted commas, warm or cool, you have to assess how close or far away it is from the coolest colour, which is the teal, and how far or close it is from the warmest colour, which is the red-orange. So once we have two colours and we have a contrast, we can then decide which two colours or which two areas are warmer or cooler. And it's just a case of which one is closer or further away from the two different poles, which one is closer to the teal. If one is closer, then that is your cooler colour by comparison. So it's all comparative in effect. So all we're doing here is creating a comparison between two sections. And really it's between this section and either side. Usually what I do is I make one side, the shadow side, I'd probably usually make that the cool side, and then I make the area in sunlight the warm side. But for this specific example, because we have so much reflected light hitting the shaded side of the face and it's coming straight off those tan coloured tiles, we have two warm sides of the face, really. It's just that this side, the left-hand side, is much more desaturated. Interestingly, when colours become desaturated, when they have less colour and they become neutralised and they head to grey, we actually start to see them as neutral entirely. They lose their perceived warm or cool value. So if you were to put two colours next to each other, a red and a green, you'd say that the green is the cool colour and the red is the warm colour. But if we start to neutralise both of those and we mix them with grey, they actually appear to lose their colour properties, which is just, it's really, I find it really interesting, but I'm a little bit of an art nerd, so that might be why I find it interesting. So what we've done here is we've got an area with less colour and an area with more colour. This side will end up feeling warmer than this side, but it's really the patch in the middle that's holding it together in terms of the warm and cool colour contrast, because this is our little patch of blue, which for me is quite an exciting area in the portrait. It's those blue eyes, and this bit of blue here is being contrasted by the rest of our comparatively warm tones. Remember, it's always a scale, a sliding scale. There is no such thing really as a warm or cool colour. It's just a case of whether one area is closer to red than another. So I've made this too light there. I've done that purposefully. And that's not just me saying that because I've made a mistake. I'm making areas a little bit more saturated with a pencil than I should so that I can blend them together in a moment. So as I said, I'm working between this dark grey, the 175, and my mid grey, which is the 273. It's the warm mid grey. And once again, I'm going to be aiming for soft edges, and that is why I'm putting down a little bit too much of some of these pencils so that I've got enough that I can just blend between them. Wherever there is a soft edge, our eye kind of just skirts over it. There's nothing to anchor it. If you imagine it like a piece of material getting snagged on a nail. If that nail is really smoothed and rounded, it's going to be much harder to snag the material on it. But as soon as it becomes sharp, that material will snag on it really easily. And our eye kind of works in the same way. If there's a really sharp defined edge between one area and another, then our eye is snagged on that area. It gets stuck there. But as soon as we've got these areas that are really smooth, our eyes can kind of just glide straight over them. We don't really look into them in that much detail. We don't scrutinize them as much, and therefore we can get away with murder in those areas, and we can just cover huge areas like we have up here with one pencil, and it can look completely correct. This bit down here needs to come a lot darker. If we look at the difference in the photograph between the nose, which is black, and the fur around it, you'll see that the difference isn't that great until we get out kind of over there. So I need to make this area darker. I'm also going to start to put in some of the shadow. Again, the reason I'm putting some of this shadow in, not the full shadow, the reason I'm putting some of it in is context, because it's going to help me see this white fur in here, which is very, very, very dark. And again, the reason it's so dark is because the face is on the floor, the light is coming in from the side, and it can't easily get into this area. So it's just not getting illuminated. And this so-called white fur has become a very, very dark grey. So this is the black. I'm going to change most of the shadow into a dark grey, but right in the core of that shadow where the light cannot reach, we need to make it black. So this is now the dark grey. Blend that in. Can always take areas darker. It's much easier with pastel pencils to make something darker than it is to make it lighter. It's the same for pretty much any medium. And again, look at this edge. Edge is way too sharp. So I'm going to smooth it first by running my finger up and down the line. And now I can decide how dark I need to take this fur in here. So this cheek here can come darker. I'm going to help to throw the nose out a little bit more. I'm going to take the black yet again for some shadow that runs underneath the cheek fur here. You can see that the black fur on the side of the face just melts absolutely seamlessly off into that shadow. I'm leaving a fairly soft edge on this shadow here instead of putting in a perfect straight line, just so that again I can blend from one thing into the next with absolute ease. So I'm not finishing the shadow at the minute, it's just not the right time in the portrait to do that, but I've put some in so that we have context, and you can see that it starts to feel again that it makes a little bit more sense why everything is so dark. So I'm just going to shade in this last little bit of so-called white fur down here. I can start to match the tone to the photograph. So right in this area, the fur is disappearing, even though it's white, it's disappearing straight into the shadow. I'm going to blend that with my finger. Do be careful of your pastel dust while you're working. Please, please keep that in mind. And then I'm going to change to my mid grey, the 273. If you've got other greys that are an intermediate between the Faber Castell dark grey and the Faber Castell mid grey, then feel free to use them. I do have a few pencils that actually they would work quite well, mainly from the Colour set actually, but for the purpose of other people being able to follow along, I'm just going to stick to these pencils because I've already used a few pencils from different brands and I know it can end up feeling a little bit confusing. And then I'm going to put in some very cautious details and then I will tap them back. So I'm using the pencil on an angle so that I was about to say brush marks, so that the pencil marks show up a little bit thicker and softer and therefore blurred. And then I can just run my finger over them and reduce the intensity. I'm going to do the same again. We can see some really soft details down here. I'm going to use my 180 just to bring in a little bit more warmth because this area here is very close to the floor, so it's going to be catching, again, a lot of that warm reflected light. So this is starting to feel really nice. We need to fix these areas up here now. I do find it easiest to work in this way, just kind of slowly building up different patches of the drawing very patiently, constantly measuring my tones against the reference photo. Is it lighter? Is it darker? Once I'm happy with my tones, is it warmer? Is it cooler? Right, here is the mid-grey, and look how bright the mid-grey shows up. Look at the reference photo and look at this. The mid-grey is probably even a little bit too bright, but we can always tap it back if we want to. But when you started out looking at this reference photo, I bet you wouldn't have picked those tones out for this area because you'd probably thought they'd have been way too dark. But it's not until we've got the context of the rest of the drawing in place that you can see how dark and how light you really can go with a lot of this. So there's a depression here that I've just ended up making a little bit too bright and we've lost it. But again, the dark tones, they will sit on top of anything nice and easily. And I'm just tapping there to make everything soft, really soft. Okay, so I'm going to begin to work around this section now. I started over there on the left-hand side of the face. It feels right to start on the right-hand side in the similar area. I do still need to address, I think some of this in here isn't quite there yet, but as I said, I feel like I'm starting to get stuck in that section a bit too much now, so let's address the other side of the face and that will help me finish the left-hand side. Now, I'm getting a lot of pinks on this side of the face, a lot of sort of very warm, beigey, pinky colours. So I am going to use the 132. Now, even if I couldn't see pinks on the warm lit area of light fur, I would usually put them in anyway. This pink alongside the bistre, as I've already said, they cousin up really nicely. They partner so beautifully and create a lovely luminous effect. It creates an area of absolute glowing brightness, the way that the two colours interact. So they are really lovely pencils to just carefully pair together. This bit all around here obviously starts to become quite a lot lighter, but I've got to watch myself. It's light and it's some of the lightest areas, but it's not as bright as you think it is. So it's all about that balance. There's a really light patch here, but I think the rest of it around the eyes actually is kind of between a value 5 and a value 10. I probably would put it at a value kind of 7. It's not as light as I think it is, so I need to try and keep that in mind. I can always take it a little bit lighter, providing I leave some space in the card, but I'll start off with these luminous colours first and see where that gets me. Now, in the really bright areas where we're catching a lot of light, as I said, white fur starts to become saturated. And while it becomes saturated, we actually start to lose details in the white fur because this is just one colour all over. Well, white is really a tone, but for the purpose of describing fur, it's one colour in this area. And we're not getting a difference, we're not getting a contrast created by the different colours in there. So it's kind of funny, as we get lighter, we start to get more details in the mid-tones and then it disappears again. And as we get into the actual highlights, we lose our details once more. So I will end up glazing over the top of quite a few of these areas and actually reducing the amount of texture. But I tend to like to start by incorporating a fair amount of texture at the beginning. It's the way I enjoy drawing. And then again, I can just reduce it as I go along. So as I said, that pencil works absolutely beautifully with the Bista, which we've already done on this side of the face, but I'm going to carry on with. So again, this pencil is nice and sharp. Working in the fur direction, I can just start to layer these up together. So like I did on the other side of the face, I'm starting with the yellow grey. Yellow grey is a funny pencil because I often think it won't show up. I didn't actually think it'd be light enough, but it is showing up fairly well. So I'm going to start with that pencil and reserve my lighter tones until I actually need them. So this is working really nicely for some of those softer areas. They're just coming out of shadow. And then once this stops showing up, then I can always go a tone lighter when I want to get more details. So now this is the Carbothello 720. This is lighter than the yellow grey, but it's not as light as my light greys from Faber Castell. So I'm glazing over sections of the face. Obviously this is making it lighter, but by glazing over it, it is allowing some of these warm tones that we've already got underneath to poke through. This pencil also isn't strong enough to cover up everything underneath it, so I'm getting some of that warmth coming through. Whether I wanted it to or not, it will come through that pencil. I'm going to start to add in some of the lighter areas, particularly around the eye, and start to thicken up the fur around there. Just going to add in, like I did on the other side, some of that darker skin that we can just see poking through around the eye. As soon as I do this, you'll find that the depth around the eye socket just starts to appear out of nowhere. So I'm just doing this by flicking the pencil very gently up. I would often put this in underneath all of the details, but I'm putting it in at sort of a midway stage so that I've got a selection of details down, the lighter light grey hairs, but they haven't dragged into this dark pencil. So I can continue adding light grey hairs on top of all this, of course, but by adding in this darker area at this stage, it just means that my markings up until this point have stayed clean quite easily. This is my light grey from Faber Castell, which I haven't actually used until this moment. This is fairly light pencil, just like the ivory that I was using. But unlike the ivory, this is a neutral, so it hasn't got that yellow feeling that the ivory's got. I just get the feeling there is more pink down here. And the warmth is working really, really nicely on that side of the face as well. So I'm just going to add a little bit more of that and then head over with the light grey. Using the pencil, honestly, so lightly for this. I'm still ending up with a little bit of a shading line there, which is irritating. I've kind of ignored the top of the nose until now. I'm actually going to go over this with one of my warmer light greys because there's already so much blue down there. I think the warm light grey is going to work better because it will neutralise some of the blue and help to harmonise it with other areas of the face. As much as it can be different, it's just a bit too different at the moment. Might even need to take it a little bit darker as well. So I could just sketch in very, very lightly, just a little bit of my mid grey using the side of the pencil. And then I can carry on with my lighter pencil over the top. And these hairs just skirt gently over the edge of that shadow. and that ties it all together. Hairs running down the nose of any dog are usually very, very flat and very short as well. So make sure not to make these hairs too long, but also they need to run into each other nicely. If they don't run in the right direction, they're going to feel like they're lifting up off the nose too much and end up with a kind of fluffy effect instead, which obviously isn't the right texture for the bridge of a nose. So I'm using this pencil really, really, really softly. I've got a slightly blunted edge on it, and I'm using it to glaze areas together. So I'm reducing the difference from one patch to the next, basically. So I'm just filling in the section around the nose with the Carbothello. So it's a little bit lighter than the yellow grey that I'd put in there earlier, but I'm being really, really light with this. So I'm just allowing it to trail out. And then I'm going to pick up the yellow grey and just create really, 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 really soft edges around those shadows. Honestly, so, so soft, all of this. Just needs to fade away really, really quietly so that we don't attract really very much attention at all down to that area. That's the wonderful thing about pastels. They can just be so soft. That's why I like using them for wildlife, and it's why most people use them for wildlife. They emulate soft textures incredibly well. So this is day 2 on the Husky. I really like taking breaks in my pet portraits. This one I had to anyway because I wouldn't be able to finish it in a day, but it really helps get your eye in. So even when I was finishing last night, I knew that this side had actually become too light in a few areas. There are too many different tones in there, and that this area is probably going to need to come lighter. So this morning, I've spent a bit of time studying the reference photo. Our lightest tone in the reference photo is between here and here. We have a little bit in the eye, and then in the reference photo, we've got a large patch where you can see the sunlight is coming straight through the window and onto the floor. Now, I'm not putting that in. I'm putting the shadow in the drawing, but I'm not putting the rest of the background in. It's not my style. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some of the tones around the outside of the cheek lighter than they appear in the photograph so that I can get some of those higher range values into the face and bring a bit more light into it. So I'm going to be really careful how I do it, but I'm going to make this side of the face a little bit lighter and increase the value range so that we don't lose out on the sunlight coming in. But I'm going to try, and I say that with difficulty, I'm going to try not to make all of this too bright. It's very, very easily done. So I'm actually going to start by making this side of the face a little bit darker. I can see tooth of the card coming through, which isn't necessarily a problem, but I think it's just a bit too light. So I'm going to take my mid-grey to start with. I use a mid-grey almost like a mixing tool. So actually, I think I've just got a little bit, just a touch too much of that 180 brown showing through. So I'm using the pencil on the side like a blending tool. I can move around, and then I'm going to take my dark grey and start to make this eye socket depression here darker. I'm not actually putting a lot of pressure through the pencil. There's loads of pastel down, so everything moves around nice and easily, which is great. And I'm going to bring that underneath the brow that's catching the light there. We know that there's a nice dark shadow here. I'm going to re-establish that and then gently move my way along. And I know this section up here can afford to catch a little bit more light as well, just this bit. And I'm just going to add a little bit more grey into the top here. It's a little bit too warm, I think, at the top. That transition needs to be softened. Again, thinking about your edge management throughout a drawing and how we get from one area into another area. So I'm making this transition softer. not just in terms of the value, we're getting lighter in here, but also in terms of the colour temperature. And then I'm just going to flip my finger very carefully along that edge, because you've got to be careful when you use your finger as a blending tool with pastel pencils, not to get rid of too many details. It's quite easily done, and then you can end up going backwards and forwards, and add so much pastel to that area of the page that your details don't take anymore. And that's really, really frustrating, because there isn't a clear way back from there, to be totally honest. I'm just going to start to lift the value of some of these areas on the brown now. So I'm starting with the yellow-grey. It will be going lighter than that, but it works so nicely, this pencil, amongst the values that we've currently got down here. It appears very softly, but it's still lifting it really subtly, so it feels quite natural. Just heading over the edge into the black there. And a word to the wise, when you're pulling a lighter tone over a darker tone, the tip of your pencil will get dirty, and you can end up pulling a lot of black down as you repeatedly go in and out between the two different sections. So just keep an eye out for that. And if you notice that you're getting little black marks in here, just wipe your pencil off on something. To be honest, I've pushed the dark black pastel into the page quite well. I'm getting a few little marks, but they're nothing horrific. So because I've pushed it into that page quite nicely, I'm not getting that much contamination happening. So already we're starting to knit those two areas together, and they start to feel natural. It's moments like this in a drawing that really start to make it and bring it together. And this is where we're going to start to see how much of that black fur we won't need to add details to as well. So as I'm moving my pencil around, I'm making sure that I'm lifting it off the page while I'm working, and that's what's giving me this really natural look to each hair stroke. So just creating that soft textured edge up there is really starting to change the portrait. So this is still the yellow-grey, but I don't really need to press very hard with this at all. We don't want a plethora of details in the areas of shadow, and that really goes for every painting you do. It doesn't need to be a pet portrait, because where there is less light, there is less detail. So that is way too light now. I'm going to swap to my mid-grey. I'm going to be tapping all this back as well. So as I get down here, and we really are out of focus down here and in the shadow, I'm using the pencil now on the side and just creating some really, really gentle markings. I'm not going in hair for hair like I was around there. It's become really, really soft until it just disappears. Again, this is something I think amateurs or, people who haven't got as much experience tend not to have the confidence to do, is stop putting details in. It's very, very difficult, actually. I think it's something that takes quite a bit of confidence to start doing, because you think, if I'm not drawing it in, it won't look right. But as you can see, this area doesn't look incorrect without details around this edge. It looks correct, it looks convincing. But what I would have expected to see on someone with less experience is simply that they'll just carry on around adding too many details over the top. So if you are new to drawing, that is something that I would suggest spending time on, is thinking about where you actually need most of your details. And of course, another way of describing that is where you need most of your hard or your found edges. They're the same thing. People just call them different names. So I'm going to keep developing this side of the face. What I'm starting to do is get stuck into the area of drawing that I've already done, but I have higher value areas to put in over here and a lot of warmth as well. So I'm going to get those in and probably finish off this ear, and then I can start to tweak the face and balance it up a little bit more. We've obviously got the back of the dog to do. The pose is a little bit unusual, and it's the pose that is giving us this really dramatic lighting, which is what I wanted to show you guys. But the back of the dog actually won't be that difficult, because again, towards the back we're losing all of our details, so actually it will be a fairly quick job on the back. So it's really getting the face correct that is going to make or break the pet portrait. Okay, so I'm going to try and finish this section here. We're going into some really, really lovely warm tones in there. So I'm going to pick up the 182 to start with, and I'm just lightly going to go over this area where we've got our lovely pinky purple. I think that was the 192 in there, and gently, very, very gently, just start to add a little bit more colour, as well as some directional marks. We don't really need to go that dark in here, but I like to heighten these colours where I can see them. It will add a bit more depth to the centre of the ear as well. Now, a lot of the fur on the ear is very, very thick. Because it's so thick, we can't see necessarily that many individual details in quite a lot of it. It's more the edges, again, just like this section down here, it's more the edges that tell us the texture that we're looking at. So it's kind of a funny area to put in, to be honest, but quite enjoyable to draw nonetheless. So I'm going to start off with my two greys that sit between the mid grey and the light grey on the Faber Castell scale. So I'm going to start with the slightly darker of the two, which is the yellow grey. So I'm looking at my photograph and I'm thinking, well, it'll be quite nice to have some gentle value steps out of this darker patch into the slightly lighter areas, and I'm looking for the darker areas of ivory fur basically, and it's all very, very close toned in this ear, to be fair, because it's out of focus as well. We've kind of grouped the values together in that section and it's simplified the entire area, but there are still some areas that are a little bit darker or a little bit lighter than others. And obviously we can heighten that if we want to. As artists, we can decide if we want to pick out more details than we can actually see. So now I'm using the 720, which is a Stabilo Carbothello pencil. Now this is a little bit too grey, as you can probably see. I do want to warm this up, but it's about the right tone. Remember that the value of your pencil is more important than the colour. So I'm going in with the right tone first, and then I'm going to just add in some different colours. I've also got this nice warm underpainting, so it won't end up quite as cool as some other areas where I've used this pencil. This isn't really a pencil I actually use very often. I bought a selection of Stabilo Carbothello greys for a pastel pencil review that I did a few months ago, so that'll be on the channel somewhere. And it was comparing one of the cheapest brands, which is this Stabilo, against one of the most expensive brands, which is the Caran Dash. And you can hear a lot of different things about pastel pencil brands and which one's the best and which one you should or shouldn't use. Ultimately, I conclude just ruining it for you, but ultimately I conclude the video by basically saying it depends, and it depends on so many different factors, but really it depends on your preference, because ultimately if you like a particularly soft pastel pencil, then you're going to enjoy probably both of those brands. But if you don't enjoy a soft pastel pencil, you might not enjoy either of the brands. It doesn't matter how expensive or cheap they are. There were some obviously pros and cons to the way each pencil worked, and I did go into that a little bit. But ultimately, I've come out of that pastel pencil review with a couple more Caran Dash that I do use slightly more often than I used to, but quite a few more Stabilo Carbothellos, and I am starting to pick them out a little bit more often than some of the Faber Castell pencils alternative that, so for example, I'm making absolutely no sense here, the ivory here. That is a Stabilo Carbothello ivory there, and I'm actually using that now more than I'm using the Faber Castell ivory. So as I'm coming down, you can probably see that it is too light round here, but I'm going to adjust it. One of the nice things about the Stabilo Carbothello pencil is it's very soft, so it's quite forgiving, and I can blend other things into it fairly easily. So I can take areas lighter, and of course I can take areas darker. So I'm going to use the Bista pencil, which I think is going to be perfect for in here. Look at the warmth that brings. So the Bista pencil, it's a funny little pencil. You could describe it as hard in that it's quite brittle, but I find it puts down pastel fairly easily, and it blends into other soft pastels really, really nicely. So I can glaze over the top of some of this. It is sending it a bit too yellow, but again, I'm going to be balancing all of this. And I can still retain some of my details from the previous layer underneath. So it's a really lovely pencil to have, especially when you want to achieve these kind of warm, blondie ivory colours. I haven't really found a pencil that equals it in the colour. But then to balance the amount of yellow that puts down, I go in with some pink, not quite as much of the pink as the Bista. And you'll find as I go ahead and add some of this pink, that instead of getting a slightly yellow colour that looks a little bit false, we warm it all up and it starts to feel more like it's glowing and catching the light. So these two colours work together beautifully, and it relies a lot on the value of the pencil, because the values of those two pencils are very, very similar. I'm just going to pick up the 182 again, very, very, very lightly. This pencil doesn't blend as nicely, but very lightly I'm just going to add in a little bit more lower value to some areas to increase the amount of depth that we've got to these huge fluffy ears. I can add a few detailed marks that I can always run over the top of and soften back with some lighter valued pencils. So it is a backwards and forwards motion when we're doing ears, but you do just want to be a little bit cautious. Depends on the amount of pencil control and experience you've got. That, as I mentioned earlier, if I haven't cut it out, you can end up overworking an area and you can add so much pastel that your details won't stick. So you've just got to keep that in mind. But if you're quite used to using your pastel pencils, you're probably quite aware of when the paper is going to become too saturated. Now I'm just starting to pick out some of the edges. Remember, the edges, as I said at the beginning of doing the ear, the edges is where we're going to find the texture. So this is where I really do need to be careful with the amount of black I'm going to accidentally bring into the ear as I flick this pencil over the edge. You've really got to keep that in mind. So again, I'm just softening these edges here where I've put down the ivory and running the pencil over it to make those markings just blend in really, really easily. So that is an edge management moment, if you like. That's why I do those kinds of things, going over, making sure that it's not too distracting. These areas don't join into each other, so I can just use my pencil slightly on the side like a blending tool. I'll waft over that until they melt in. So I think really we're getting on for a slightly whiter colour up there. I'm going to start with the light grey, not the white. As I said, I will be taking this area lighter, but I want to be cautious in how I do it. I don't want to overdo it too quickly. I've still got quite a few areas to put in yet. So this is yellow grey again, and I'm just starting to put some details in along the edges, which these hairs down here aren't catching the light. They're more silhouetted by it. But obviously it's still very important to start to create a nice textured edge down there. So they hardly show up against the page, very similar in tone. Then I'm going to take this is the warm dark grey, the 175, and using it incredibly softly, just dabbing it onto the page, putting a little bit of the edge of that black here as it disappears. You can see immediately that changes how the ear feels, just that tiny little bit up there. And then I'm going to sharpen it up for the next bit. You could sharpen it up for that bit as well, really. But as you can see, my pencil is very blunt. So with a nice sharp pencil, we can start to carefully add in a few wisps that are just going in between these light hairs. Now, you can use the black for this. To be honest, it depends on the day as to which pencil I'm going to pick up. And I'll often say this in my tutorials, whatever you want to call them, there is no right or wrong way for absolutely everything. And I think that is actually an idea that holds a lot of people back. You feel as though you don't know how to do a certain type of dog, for example. And so you need to find a specific tutorial exactly on that dog. And I used to be like that with lots of different things. And I still am like that with mediums that I'm less confident in. But what I'd love to say to you, and definitely go away and have a think about this, is consider what you already know and how you can apply the knowledge and the skills that you already have to the problem in front of you. So for example, you could have looked at the beginning at this husky dog and thought, I've not drawn a husky before, so I don't know how to do it. But if you sit and analyse it just as an area of texture, then you could come away and think, actually, I know how to do most of it because I can already, for example, could already draw flat fur or straight fur. I can't do curly fur, I haven't done that before, but I can already do straight fur. Well, effectively, that's all this is. Now, there are some extra techniques that you can apply, but you can work out the areas that need to be worked in a different way simply by studying your reference photo for a while and thinking about how thick the fur is, thinking about how the wind would move it, thinking about how much depth there is to it and how far in between each hair can we see down into the fur. If you go through and really analyse what you're looking at, you come out with a list of things that you need to work towards to create the texture you're seeing. To be honest, that's a great way to start to learn how to do different areas on a dog. So I have had a change of heart and I have swapped to the black for this. The dark grey just wasn't showing up quite as well, so I'm just going to use the black. I like to remain very light with my pencil, or as light as I can, to do these areas and not put loads of pressure through it. So if one pencil isn't showing up, go shade darker. You can see, just like when we pull the light hairs from the dark into the light, when we do this in reverse, we will get areas where we can suddenly get lots of splodges of light into the black fur. So you just have to clean those up as you go along. So I'm just going along and filling in the tooth of the card a bit more to make this feel much thicker, losing some details basically as I do that, and I am making it lighter than it actually is in the photograph. So this is catching more light than the photograph. So I'm going to fill in the cheek now, which will effectively complete the face in terms of everything has got something on it of roughly the right value. Obviously that ear needs filling in, but it is roughly the right value already. So once this has gone in, we can start to really push and pull the values on the lip side of the face and see how light we want to take this. So this area here, it's overexposed, it's a complete loss of detail in there, so I'm using the pencil on the side to transition that. So we're just missing a bit of the shadow in there, so I will add that in because of course it is going to change how light this area looks. So I'm using the warm dark grey for that. So now I'm going to add in those dark hairs, which are just poking out underneath. Now, you could have put this in before as part of the underpainting, but often when it's right on the edge like this, and we've got these hairs coming out as well, so we've got edge detail to do in the dark grey or a black, I quite like to put it in after and simply weave some of the black or dark grey, whatever you want to use, into the edge of the light fur. But again, it kind of depends on what side of the bed I wake up on in the morning as to which way around I end up doing it. So there is, again, no right, no wrong. It's a case of what works best for you. If you'd find this too difficult, then try putting in a light underpainting, a slightly grainy underpainting with a dark tone first, and then put your light values on top of that. And I'll probably go over the top with some of the lighter tones anyway. So now I'm starting to increase the saturation effectively and increase the value really of the white fur. So where there's more light, the white fur will appear to be brighter, more saturated, and I'm just increasing what I can already see in the photograph. As I said, I'm making this side of the face lighter than it actually is. So I quite like doing it around the eyes anyway, because it brings more attention to the eyes, and the eyes really, for me, are the focal point of pretty much any portrait that I do. So I've lightly just sped up through a lot of what I've been doing. And all I've been doing really is increasing the contrast. So I've been increasing the amount of light tones that are in the piece, and then I've also been carefully increasing them slightly on this side as well. I'm going to approach that brow too, but I'm thinking I might introduce a little bit of a pinky colour into that, which would work quite nicely with this warm and cool colour contrast. I'm now going through with one of my cool light greys, the light grey from Caran, and I'm just adding a little bit of this into the areas where it's lighter but still in shadow Again, just playing with that warm and cool colour contrast, it can really help sometimes to add a little bit more depth without necessarily even changing the value of an area. So I really do like to work between the blues and the pinks and the yellows when I'm working with white fur. It helps a lot. But you can see as I've gone through and increased the contrast around this drawing, we've got a lot more dimension and it's starting to feel much more realistic. So I think I said earlier on we'd add a little bit of blue into this reflection, so I'm just using the light grey because the light grey from Caran does have quite a lot of blue in it. So it's lovely and soft, this pencil. I can just work a large blob and then blend it around with the pencil and tap it off. So I worked a bit of the darker blue, the 140, around the edge, and then I'm just going to take the purple, I love to do this, and work the purple just gently into the edge of the darkest areas. Just around here, kind of like we did with the black fur. Work it around that highlight as well. It really rounds things out. So that highlight really doesn't need to be particularly bright on the nose, so don't overdo this bit up here. Don't forget we have got this small half crescent highlight there, which just tells us where the nostril is, and that is pretty much all the detail that you need on the nose. So again, don't get tempted to get carried away with the nose and add in what we can't see in the photograph. It doesn't need it. I'm just going to add in a little bit of the 042. I haven't got actually a name for this pencil, but it's a kind of peachy colour, I guess, from Caran. I've had it ages. It was given to me as a sample pencil, and actually it was the first Caran I'd ever used, not even that long ago, to be fair. And I'm just going to use it incredibly lightly on this side. You see the value of it, of course, is higher than what we've already got down, so it is making it lighter, but it's going in with an intense and lovely orange warmth, so that's really starting to glow. I'm going to do the same on the other side. I'm really not putting a lot of this on here. Obviously, you don't specifically need this pencil. The 132 from Faber Castell has a nice similar effect, but this pencil had been playing on my mind since I started the piece, and I thought, no, I want to include just a touch of this in the areas that are rounding into the light. So before I overdo it with that pencil, I'm going to put it down. As I said, you could use the 132 for this section as well. As you can see, it's quite a different pink, but it will have a similar effect of warming it up. And then over the top of that, I think I'm going to try the warm light grey from Faber Castell. I don't want to go too light. And I think the ivories might be too light, so I want it to be quite warm. I'm not going to press very hard with the pencil. So again, I don't want it to become too bright. Okay, so coming into the black fur, I know I said I was going to do this as a time lapse, but I totally lied. Coming into the black fur, I am going to start to introduce a little bit more purple. I'm going to introduce it and then knock it back by working over the top with grey. To be honest, in this photograph, we don't really need to go into all of those kind of secret colours in black fur, but it is nice to add them in nonetheless. So where it is slightly lighter, and we've got some of these grey hairs catching the light, I'm gently going round with the 160, which is a lovely purple colour, and I'm just adding a few hair markings. On camera, these might not even show up that well for you. They kind of have a slight bouncing effect on the page in that you can't pick them out quite easily, but you know something's there. So I'm just going to add these in, and then over the top I'll go around with the grey, and then I'll tap it all back. So incredibly, at this part, I finally decided to shut up. I'm not quite sure how I've managed to talk I've edited stuff out, so probably a good 2 hours of just talking unscripted. You could say it's a talent. But I go ahead and fill in the back of the dog. Now, all that I really want to share with you guys about filling in sections like this is, again, edge management. This is where you really want very, very soft edges. And that's just because the center of attention is nearly always the eyes, or at the very least the face for your pet portrait. And remember, the edges are a little bit like a nail. The sharper a nail is, the more a piece of clothing can snag on it. So the sharper an edge is in your painting, painting, the more your eye is going to get stuck there. The softer the edges, the less likely your eye is to have a look over there and get stuck. Obviously, we do need the back of the dog in for the portrait to make sense, as well as the shadow, but all of your transitions can be very smooth and we don't need loads of details here. We are almost towards the end of this pet portrait now, and if you have got this far, then congratulations, and don't forget that there are loads of full-length tutorials available in the membership. Got my white pencil really nice and sharp for this. So leaving the ones on the right hand side, they're absolutely fine, but then starting to work on the shaded side of the face and tapping over these whiskers. They should almost be disappearing. And then for these up here, you've got two options. You can tap, but there's quite a few details in there. So I'm going to take the yellow grey, might need to go a little bit darker, and I'm just going to work at the base of that eyelash, and they start to disappear in. So I'm going to go just a touch darker, pick up the 182, and just really, really gently kind of stroking the bottom of that mark until we can't see where the whisker originates from anymore. So now your portrait is ready to sign. When it comes to signing, try not to pick anything that's too domineering. I tend not to go for black because all that happens is your signature takes up a lot of real estate space and your eye is constantly distracted by this black signature down in the corner. So I tend to go for something that is visible but isn't going to distract. So the Bista, for example, that's a lovely option for this colour of card. Whilst it's there, if we come back and have a look at the whole image, it doesn't distract the eye that much. Thank you so much for watching. If you are inspired to become a pet portrait artist, then do check out the membership. I am adding more and more pet portrait courses to the membership, but there's also a techniques library and a theory section that can really help you pick out your pencils and get to grips with all of the different fur techniques that you need to know. All that's left to say is please, if you can, give this video a thumbs up or leave me a comment. It will really help small channels like mine to grow a little bit more and bring you guys more free stuff.